The Archaeology of Death and Memory with Professor Howard Williams. It's Archaeodeath.
Welcome, Archaeo Deathlings, to a further Archaeo Death interview and another extra special guest, a postgraduate researcher and a voice of good in a world of madness, I feel. Owen, it's great to have you here. Please introduce yourself in a more formal way than my ramble.
Thanks, Howard. Actually, I mean, I think I might change my email signature to have however you describe me there. But yes, my name's Owen Hercombe. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of York in archaeology. And yeah, my research kind of focuses, well, on trans stuff related to archaeology, both in terms of how we talk about gender across deep time perspective, but also where archaeology is as a discipline on trans inclusion and where it is influencing current discourses on trans acceptance or not in the UK and further afield. So a broad sweep.
That's really exciting, and I've dealt, and with guests, I've dealt with aspects of that topic before on the Archaeo Death channel. But I think, and you've also contributed to the mortuary memes workshops, which so with your own research and standing in as a wonderful chair for one of the workshops too. So people will have encountered you in my digital spaces in various ways. But I really appreciate you coming here to talk about this. And there's a particular thing we want to focus on today, and there are some. I would like to ask, before we get into that, a little bit more background about your work. But I think we should dedicate most of this conversation to the specific piece of text that you've written, and will be a first ever share on the Archaeodeath blog, a guest blog on the Archaeodeath blog, because I think we need to get into the detail of that. But can I just press you for a little bit more detail about how you got into the world of archaeology and how you got to do the research topic that you're doing as a doctoral researcher at York?
Yeah, no problem. So I got into archaeology due to my dad, which is and Time Team, but it was watching Time Team with my dad from about the age of 4. And we religiously watched it. I actually have, my friends laugh at this, I got a sword from Time Team season 8 episode 3 tattooed on me because I was like, Time Team is life. So from about the age of 4, with a brief spell of wanting to be a train driver or an international rugby player for Wales, archaeology was always what I wanted to do. And so I applied for a lot of archaeology undergraduate degrees. That would have been for 2016, and I moved up to North Wales to Bangor University for that. Studied with, I think, some of your former colleagues at Chester and people you work very closely with.
Yeah.
And that was really lovely. And I stayed in Bangor to do my master's, and my undergraduate was very quote unquote traditional. It was about a site. I did a geophysical survey. It wasn't theoretical archaeology. And I'd actually planned a master's to excavate the site. I'd been given kind of permission to excavate it by the local archaeological unit, the HER unit, sorry, as part of my master's if Bangor University were on board. Then the pandemic happened. So I was doing my master's, running a dig wasn't feasible. So I was thinking, okay, what am I going to turn my master's into? And then it was, I think, the second week, and Gary Robinson, who was my supervisor, basically gave me some reading on feminist archaeology, because he knew from my undergraduate days that, and I said, I don't really like archaeological theory. I don't get the point, which is completely wrong. The point's fantastic. But undergraduate Owen was less. Effectively, Gary was like, okay, I didn't give you these readings at undergraduate because it wasn't within the module back then. But for a master's, here you go. And I was like, Gary, this is the best thing ever. And so from feminist archaeology, I moved into queer archaeology, reading the works of Thomas Dowson. Particularly, I mean, there's lots of different queer archaeologists, but he was the founding voice of the subdiscipline. And I thought it was the best stuff ever written. And I was like, okay, so for my master's, I could do effectively a review of how queer archaeology as a school of thought formulated and where it's come from. So that was my master's. And in that, I noticed that while there were some trans perspectives, it was very much queer archaeology had focused more on cis-normative LGB identities rather than, and even then not really bi identities, rather than trans identities. And so I was like, great, I can take this forward for my PhD. And funnily enough, that has involved actually working with Thomas Dawson. He's fantastic, and obviously trans identities weren't omitted vindictively. They were just not his lived experience and not the focus of the time. And what's really cool is at TAG, where last year I was in your session, me and Thomas are actually running a session looking at 25 years of queer archaeology and where it needs to go. So my journey very much moved into theoretical and kind of this queer feminist subaltern perspective. And so I decided, great, let's do trans archaeology. Let's do an archaeology of what it means to be trans as an archaeologist, but also what archaeology is saying about the trans community today and in the past, kind of answering the call that Mary Westmantel put out in 2013. I'm saying a lot of names, I know, but most of these are
it's important.
Blog anyway.
Exactly. So, well, let's leave it there with your PhD, because I think this is a topic that in good time, PhDs need respect. You know, it's good to name check them, but they exist as emerging auras of messiness and they need, you know, I don't want to sort of press you on preliminary inquiry, you know, outputs and ideas there, but you've been very busy, you know, both in terms of, you know, the networking, presentation, building ideas and connect, you know, and I'm learning and really appreciate your TAG session that you co-organized at TAG last year, and I'm looking forward to this one. But we really should focus on this specific moment and what you've written as a guest blogger on Archaeodeath, and just to thank you for agreeing to have Archaeodeath as a venue, and I think we should perhaps come back to that issue of the venue, but I would like to focus on why you're writing a piece called British Archaeology following the Supreme Court ruling on trans rights. What's this about? Why write about this at this time? Why not just let it lie for a year or two and then write some clever peer-reviewed academic article about how Britain was a mess in 2025? You know, why actually write it at the moment?
Yeah, well, because writing an article in 2 years' time about why Britain was a mess in 2025 will be easy. Everyone could do that. Britain is such a mess. But no, I to be less flippant, thank you again for agreeing to host what I'd written. Again, we'll get into the reasons why it's ended up on Archaeodeath. But yeah, the reason I wrote this article and have agreed to do this interview, and I'm doing it now, is because, I mean, quite frankly, being a trans person in the UK right now is terrifying. I mean, the Supreme Court decision, for those who don't know, it was the for Women Scotland versus the Scottish ministers. It was a ruling that effectively, under UK law, within the confines of the Equality Act, redefined what sex and gender were in ways they've never been understood before, effectively excluding trans people, including trans people with a gender recognition certificate, which was brought in by effectively the European Court of Human Rights. But anyway, it redefined sex and gender to basically say that trans women weren't women and trans men weren't men, and that non-binary people like myself don't exist at all. And the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, followed this up with a series of guidance on how to, the practicalities of running organizations, of public spaces following on the Supreme Court ruling. There's more detail in the article because it's quite convoluted and hard to explain in an interview fashion, but effectively what happened when this came out when this ruling came out was trans rights in the UK were set back to a place they've never been before, where legal recognition was effectively ripped up and the possibility of legal segregation was introduced. The law has not gone so far as to mandate legal segregation, but effectively it says if anyone requests that trans people are refused access to single-sex spaces, that is a legally valid position. So in archaeology, for example, if a trans woman was wanting to do away work with an archaeological company, and that company was one that put people up in dormitory accommodation rather than affording single occupancy accommodation, if a cis woman in that company said, I will not share with a trans woman, she would be legally segregated from attending that away work if they couldn't provide alternative accommodation. So it's and obviously that's an example in archaeology, but it's across the board, and it follows a continuing decline of trans rights in the United Kingdom, such as the removal of puberty blockers for trans youth. And it's one of the many reasons why the Lemkin Institute has declared what's happening in the UK evidence of genocidal intent against trans people. So it was a consequential and monumental moment. And I decided, because of this, that it would be time to write about it from that archaeological perspective. So not just the example I gave earlier of away work, but my reality as an openly trans archaeologist in a research position in archaeology, how my organization has handled or rather mishandled it, and the conversations that I'm having with other trans archaeologists in the field when I'm on field work, but also in my network and in my direct place of work. So I thought this is a huge moment for trans rights and archaeology, the kind of archaeology that I'm interested in, queer archaeology, feminist archaeology, activist archaeology. Well, this is a defining moment for the discipline in terms of, will it stand with a persecuted minority, or will it decide that it doesn't want to put its head above the parapet and take a laissez-faire approach? And so I wanted to push, for my part, as much as I could, archaeology towards getting a more engaged and immediate response to the ruling, and then was immediately hit with the laissez-faire, non-committal, keeping their heads firmly away from the parapet response by some organizations, but not all of archaeology. I mean, you're for yourself, you've been fantastic on this and sharing the open letter as well. But we can get into all of that because
so it's difficult to break down because I don't know. I'm not a professional interviewer, and I don't want to pretend I am. But I'm trying to get my head out, because it's the message of what you have a network of knowledge, network knowledge of people who sit within academia, commercial, museum, governmental. You have that knowledge of people who live that experience as archaeologists, as employed or students who are this affects, right? So there's a community, but there's also a future community that may not exist visibly or at all and there's also a past story of how we got here, and I think it's really powerful that you say, there was a past. This is taking us back to a time that never was, because there never was a time. It's not as if in the 50s or in the 80s there was a time where all this was legislated and we repealed all this bigoted legislation. That was never there. And we've created, and I think it's international pressure and governmental pressure and activist groups who are funded from outside the UK, within particular political circles, have created this storm, haven't they, that have pushed this. I mean, is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty fair. In terms of the specifics, obviously, I'm only 27. I'm a younger trans person. I'm not going to claim that trans rights have always been fantastic.
No.
But in terms of in my lifetime, and in the lifetime of trans people I know who are older, they are saying this is the worst it's ever been. The UK had Section 28 from 1988 to 2003, and various local counties then also had minor versions of that until about 2010. And that prohibited the promotion of homosexuality. So we've had similar laws, and we've had laws that are direct influences. But since about 2002, Goodwin versus the United Kingdom was a landmark ruling at the European Court of Human Rights that basically introduced legal trans recognition as we have it in the UK. So before that, while there were trans people, there was no mandated of their legal recognition, although lots of them were recognised in their places of work. I mean, all over the place. And we've got news articles from like the 1930s of trans acceptance. We've got a document from 1395 of trans acceptance. The laws of Hywel Dda in North Wales in the 900s have a law recognising intersex and non-binary identities. I mean, they're not great because it's all about inheritance and how you can inherit better if you opt to do masculine ways, but at least you have the choice, right? So what I'm trying to say is, yes, it's never been perfect. The law has got ups and downs, but broadly until the late 2010s, trans rights were going from a position of not existent but not militantly opposed necessarily, to legal acceptance, to now being both legally opposed and militantly opposed by a lot of the general population. So yes, it's kind of gone on a bell curve, and it's going further down. Of course, I'm caveating that with the fact that I'm a trans person who's not that old, and who is most of my stuff has been, yes, everything currently is personal experience, but anything pre 2005 is research based, and and yes, based on talking to a lot of trans people from older generations as well. But yeah, it's unprecedented in terms of how far backwards we're going on every metric for trans acceptance in the UK.
And this affects everyone in society, and there's a number of different levels to it. There's the many people can sit back and go, well, it doesn't affect me. I don't give a toss who does what, bathrooms and stuff. But there's also the people that are worried about their family members, they're worried about people they know, but there's also people who are directly affected, who actually, they don't know when and how it will affect them. They don't know. There's so much uncertainty, isn't there? So there's lots of confusion and ambiguity. Is that a fair thing to say? I mean, I know there's the guidance, but a lot of people are just sort of wondering when this is going to impact them in some horrible circumstance. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's
the fear.
Fair.
The fear. You say
There's a lot of fear. So the exact final word in the guidance, the consultation has happened. The trans community kind of know exactly where it's heading, which is this quasi-legal segregation, where segregation is legal if you request it. I mean, the guidance used some awful words, like if a trans person causes alarm or distress to a cis person, they can be asked to leave. The trans person can be asked to leave. If a trans person is lying about their birth sex, they can be asked to leave. It can be requested that we have to prove what genitals we have to access certain services. And if the service is like, if a trans man is too masculine, then they can't be in a man space because they're trans, but they can't be in a women's space because they're too masculine having transitioned. So then they're going to need to be forced into a third space. It's the fear of having to be outed at your place of work because you have to navigate these new protocols and new rules. So there's a lot of fear. There's also fear about the precedents it's setting, following on from the puberty blockers being removed for trans youth and the fact that trans adult healthcare is currently under review. And so, I mean, for an example, in my daily life as a trans archaeologist working here in the University of York, somebody had put up some pro-trans graffiti in the University of York. I thought that was really nice. This wasn't removed by the University of York cleaners. It was removed by somebody who opposes trans rights. It was scribbled out, crossed out, and stuff like that. And another sticker that was somewhere else was ripped down. So I know there are people in the department. I don't know who they are, obviously. And they might not even be in the department. They might just be visitors to the building to give,
Yeah, but they're around.
They're around. And I was recently on field work. And walking to site, I got spat directly on in my face because that's just and no one did anything. Like the people I was with, they were all very supportive, and a lot of them were queer themselves. And the spit was clearly directed at us as a group, but no one else, none of the just the public intervened or did anything because it's just what happens now. And I'm both scared for my physical health, but I'm scared what's going to happen to the healthcare I have. I'm scared that when I go on away work, right, with my university, what are there places like there are conference venues I cannot attend because it's not good in the UK, it's worse in other places. Also, if I even traveling within the UK, what's to say, where do I go? Where do they put me? Where can my university, where can my place of work keep me safe? They can't. And I know people who are working on large infrastructure projects who manage to get in because even though their government ID and their work ID don't match because they're trans, they manage to get into site because their workplace backed them. Their workplaces may no longer do that. And I know people who really had to fight for months and months and months to be given access to these large infrastructure projects to work on them as field archaeologists as well. And equally, I know people, having interviewed them for my PhD, who have stopped their hormones or decided to not start a medical transition they've always wanted because they were unsure if they would be supported doing that in the field. And this decision just furthers that. Are you gonna, as a trans person, are you gonna want to become an archaeologist if your place of work has a track record of not accommodating trans people, or at least listening to the voices of those who scream alarm or distress because a trans person is on their site? So it's got huge fear and ramifications in archaeology and in broader society as well, because we're moving headlong towards a position where being trans in the UK is completely untenable. Not to sound over dramatic, because trans people are accused of being dramatic all the time. I know trans people who are no longer with us because of what's been happening to the trans community in the UK. I know parents of trans children who are desperately trying to leave the country because their child no longer has access to the life-saving medication they need just because they are trans. I know other archaeologists who are on the verge of quitting archaeology because they are trans. And I know, again, through this community of communities, trans people who are looking and really excited to start an archaeology undergraduate here in the University of York, who are no longer doing that because the University of York is one of many higher education institutions who have not firmly stood for trans rights. And it's really depressing.
It is depressing and concerning, and we don't want to ramp up beyond. But you're not ramping up. You're speaking very clearly. But my point, I said that I don't want to ramp up because I was going to add something else. I don't want to. But my point would be, as someone who is cisgender, it does affect me. It affects me as a teacher. It affects me as a researcher. It affects me as a parent of every one of my offspring, and me and my wife and my family get accused of being trans as an insult. Everyone is talking about this in derogatory name. So it's anyone out there who's listening to this think, oh, this is just about people who are non-binary or who have transitioned or whatever. It's not. It's about us as a society and what we will tolerate and what we will indulge, and will we let extremists push agendas that put us all at risk of casual abuse, of structural. So that's my feeling on them. I know that's not the core, but I just wanted to add that for people who may feel.
You're hitting an important nail on the head. Of course, it should be enough to stand up to bigotry against a minority because a minority is being bigoted against. But you're right. There is that there's that further avalanche of issues in terms of it will affect everyone, because like trans people exist in all manners of everyday life, and they look like all manner of everyday people because we are just everyday people, which means everyone, regardless of their gender, regardless if they're cis, trans or otherwise, is going to fall victim to this legislation, because a cis person can just as easily be asked to prove what gender they are, right?
Exactly.
And beyond that, like, where do you think they're going to stop? Like, they're not going to stop with removing trans rights. They're going to keep going. And trans rights and women's rights are the same fight, right? Iceland realized this, and it's why Iceland has one of the highest levels of trans acceptance in Europe, because their feminist movement realized that actually we don't want the government to define what womanhood is. We want to define what it is, right? And that includes trans people, because, spoiler alert, trans women are women, right? And so if we let those who want hegemonic gender roles, if we let those who want to hark back to an authority, a tradition of gender that's only in their heads, because the archaeological record categorically disproves modern Western Victorian gender hegemony, then, you know, we're opening the UK up to a situation where being any kind of minority is going to pose a massive threat. And by any kind of minority, that's ever going to growing list. Sure, right now the main targets in the UK are immigrants, it's trans people, it's it's those are the big scapegoats right now. But the working class are always being persecuted against, women are always being persecuted against, and it's just going to get wider and wider and wider, and to the point where effectively everyone is going to be under some kind of authoritarian pressure. And again, it always sounds dramatic to say that, but there is no pleasure as a trans person in saying we told you so. But every time a trans person in the UK has said, hey, they're trying to do this to my community, and somebody has said, no, they're not, you're just being dramatic, well, it's happened. Like 3 years ago, we said they want to take away healthcare for trans kids. No, that's not happening. It's happened. 2 years ago, oh, they want to bring in a Section 28 style law specifically for trans kids. That's happening. So every time we say something's happening, we've been proved right, which is, again, we don't enjoy that. Nothing would give me more joy than for somebody to be able to say that I'm talking out my arse and them to be correct, because it would mean my community is safe.
Yeah, and if 5 years' time, Owen, look, all those unfounded fears were all, but that's I'd be a relief, wouldn't it? But it doesn't seem to be the way it's going. And so, I mean, there's different questions to ask, but I suppose what the final, well, not the final, but the next point I want to ask is, what is specific to archaeology? You could be an activist and you'd make these legitimate and valid and truly, heartbreaking to hear about how this affects individuals, and we can't get into that, but I'm aware of in my own communities of individuals that are no longer with us and are struggling as well, but are with us. But what would you say in terms of are the specifics of archaeology? Archaeology involves working with other people, working in public spaces, itinerant. There's those aspects you mentioned, but are there any other things that are particularly archaeological about this situation, or affect archaeologists in a distinctive way?
Yes, I mean, I think archaeology is very, so one of the things that's really interesting about archaeology is it is a discipline that seems to attract members of the LGBTQ plus, trans and non-binary specifically communities at a higher than average rate. Like the census, the 2021 census said about 0.5 less than percent of the UK's population identify as trans. Most archaeological audits have that number, depending on who you go. Well, all of them are higher than 0.5%. The lowest is about 0.7. The highest is about 5%. The average is about 4 to 5% based on sample size. So we're attracting trans people at a far higher rate than most places that are most employers. And there's potentially other reasons for this. More people feel like they can come out as trans in archaeology because it has, for whatever reasons, or it's just a discipline that naturally attracts trans people. And I don't really know why on either of those would be the case. But it's interesting. It means that, like, again, even if just there was one trans archaeologist in the UK, they deserve protection, right?
Of course, obviously. Yes, it's not on numbers. Yes, game, but yes, of course.
The fact our discipline has so many trans people currently in it, right? And if we want to champion ourselves as a diverse practice, we have to support them, because if archaeologists, if that corpus, that core group of archaeologists keep moving through and are being forced out, it's going to stop other people coming in. And we provide embodied knowledge and phenomenological perspectives that really aid interpretation. And this goes on to the rest of it. And it is kind of a symbiotic relationship, because we're able to support archaeological work, and that archaeological work in turn supports gender variance in modern day society. So a fantastic example of this is the Swantaka individual, which I mentioned in your mortuary memes.
That's all right, yeah.
The Swantaka individual I really love, because it kind of shows these layers. So 1968, it's excavated. They're excavated in Finland, in Swantaka in Finland by Oiva Keskitalo. They are an 1,000-year-old, they were buried 1,000 years ago. It's 2 swords, some feminine clothing, and some bones. Oiva Keskitalo says, well, this is either a double burial with significant erosion or a mannish housewife. Feminist archaeology and feminist archaeologists then come along and say it was probably a warrior woman, which there's a lot to be said about equating swords and warrior status, but for the sake of this, let's keep it narrow. And great, yeah, that's a better interpretation, in my opinion, than, it can't possibly be a woman with swords. And then an ADN analysis came along and showed that this person had an extra chromosome, XXY, and this was that means them intersex. And then trans archaeologists, queer archaeologists came along and said potentially non-binary. Now, I never am ever going to prescribe gender identity onto anyone who can't tell me what it is. So the Swantaka individual is whatever gender they were, really not interested in exactly what that was, other than that it was something, right? But this shows that when you get people coming from different backgrounds, you're able to improve the ability of your archaeology, or offer alternative and more plausible explanations. And because we're then doing that, archaeology, if we're talking about people in an archaeological record as potentially being beyond the binary, which, spoiler alert, they definitely were, we just need to have the archaeologists able to recognize this potential, then that itself provides community to trans people who often feel so alone. There's something in applied transgender studies called gender minority stress, which is effectively trans people suffer a lot of mental health conditions, far more than the average cis person, right? And this isn't inherent to being trans. Gender minority stress shows that the reason that trans people feel like this is because of the stress of being a gendered minority in the UK or wherever the country is studying. And one of the main reasons is that disconnect from community. So archaeology is a really useful tool for trans people because it can elucidate beyond the binary genders across deep time, like the Swantaka individual, like BJ581, like many Anglo-Saxon graves. I can't remember the exact cemetery. I can just remember their like designations, which is really unhelpful when you can't remember the cemetery.
No.
But across lots of different cultures and lots of different periods. And that then provides a community you might not otherwise feel. It makes you know you're not alone. Moreover, one of the most pernicious attacking points on trans people today is this idea of trans presentism. It's this idea that trans is just a trend. It's just a modern trend. Yeah. So archaeology highlighting whether these people were trans or not, but at the very least that they were doing gender differently to hegemonic cishood, that's enough to disprove this idea, to disprove that gender is these two binary things and always has been, and therefore always should be. It's all interconnected. So I think it's really, archaeology has a really important and specific voice to challenge the Supreme Court ruling, to challenge the ESRC guidance, not just to protect archaeologists within it, and not just because protecting trans archaeologists enables archaeology to be a better discipline, but because if we want an activist archaeology, a transformative archaeology, as people like Sonia Atley have argued, or TJ Ferguson have argued, or Randall H. Maguire, if we want an archaeology that does good in the world, this is a litmus test for are we prepared to actually do it?
So much I want to rant about there, but thank you. That is a brilliantly articulated point. So the subject of archaeology attracts trans people, phenomenological experiences, inform our understanding of the past, but also, you know, this is all about a bigger story about how archaeology can and should or could disrupt the cozy normativities of our world, and that this threatens some people. They don't want that. They want a past that is just finding some old coins and here's someone grinning as they find it. And look, some people benefit from archaeology going on a dig because it gets them outside, but they don't want archaeology that actually challenges us to think about anything. But
no, exactly.
You know, that's my feeling, and I think that's where it threatens people. Jumping on, if I may, but obviously we can circle back to things if you feel we've missed out anything. But what did you therefore ask of the archaeological community in the UK to do in this circumstance? What was your petition about? How did you go about this? What was your point? Why do a petition? What did you want of the community, the collective, about this?
So I think based on all the reasons that were just outlined, I saw how important it was that archaeology should do this. Also, I consider myself an activist first, archaeologist second, and there's lots of literature on being an activist archaeologist, so I know it's possible to combine those two. So I say, funnily enough, I was at a wedding the day the Supreme Court judgment was announced, and so it was this moment of pure joy for my friends and celebrating with them, to then seeing the inevitable and absolutely crashing. And then after I took the next day off because I was distraught, I was like, okay, something has to be done. And by this time, other letters in other disciplines had already started circulating, specifically the one for the Royal Geographic or Geographers Society.
Okay.
I remember reading and thinking, that's really good, let's do an archaeology one. So I worked with some members of the University of York Archaeology Department, I worked with some of my friends at UCL, and we drafted a letter together, and I have eternal thanks to those initial people, the people who helped initially draft this letter. So we wrote a letter that is linked on the blog post on Archaeodeath, and that basically said, we want the CBA, Council for British Archaeology, FAME, the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers, UA UK, University Archaeology UK, and CIFA, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, as large and influential bodies, public bodies in the UK. We want them to stand firm with their trans members, to condemn the ruling for scientific illiteracy on the grounds of deep time perspectives of gender, which archaeology has elucidated, and also to show that genders are not the way that the Supreme Court ruling has interpreted them, and that the archaeological community will not accept segregation within the discipline of trans people, and that we're all equal as archaeologists. I think it was written a little bit more tightly on the letter, but that's the short. That's
and
the
people can
short
follow
worded
that up and
version.
read it for themselves. I'm not obviously I'm not
Exactly.
trying to test you on the precise wording,
No.
but it's more the spirit was to say,
Yeah.
this isn't simply affecting members
Mhm.
of this professional and academic set of communities, because we're many sub communities, but this is something we have expertise to speak on. We're not just casual, oh look, there are some historians who happen to be trans, or there are some geographers that happen to be. These are subjects that, as humanities and social science subjects, are actively, supposedly, allegedly, not far from impartial. We have active research to contribute to society's understandings of people today, we claim. So
Exactly.
this is a moment where we should be enacting that, not being
No,
not just
indeed.
You're
right. Yeah, it's sorry.
Yeah.
Classic interview thing where we're both agreeing.
Sorry to repeat you. I'm just trying to get it in my head.
No, exactly. But yes, no, you're right. It was basically the letter came together, and it was like, we want to call these organizations to do the following things, and importantly, put out public statements, because the only way to challenge institutionalized bigotry, the only way to challenge transphobia that is having the authority of the UK government right now, is for large, professional, important and prolific public organizations to counter that narrative. So putting statements out was really key, and it was something we really wanted. So we wrote the letter calling on them to do these things, shared it. I think it was open for 5 days for signatures. Maybe it was 7 days, I'm not sure. And we got 700 plus signatures in that time from all across the UK's archaeological and heritage community. Anyone who, of any gender, who felt themselves to be within the UK archaeology sector could sign this letter. The letters then went off. And this immediately got me, as one of the main writers of the letter, through the door of several organizations to talk to them about this, which was nice. I will say it was very nice to have immediate conversations with these organizations and additional organizations. Prospect Archaeologist Branch in particular, shout out to them. They invited me to speak ahead of a vote they were taking, because some of their members had already done their own motion. Right. So that was, I can't remember the name of those two members, but it's all on the minutes. It was a public, but they already had their own motion for trans acceptance in Prospect Archaeologist Branch going ahead. But Prospect invited me to speak at that, and that was really good. And I will say, Prospect Branch archaeologists, they've done really good stuff on this. The stuff that I'm about to say does not apply to them.
No. I mean, you did get positive responses.
I did get positive responses.
Yeah. And just for those who don't know, Prospect are a union that represents in the archaeological sector mainly commercial archaeologists. That applies across. So for example, in the academic sector, it's UCU. But I don't think they have an archaeology branch for UCU. I'm not aware of one.
No.
So there's no equivalent, which is a thing in itself. But my point is just so that viewers and listeners have that sort of sense of context. So you got some response. Can I, before we go on, 770?
704.
704. Sorry, that is a substantial fraction of the total workforce in our UK archaeology. You'll know better than me. I can't remember. We're not a huge industry. People like to use the word industry, but that is quite a fraction. I don't know what fraction off the top of my head, but it's not tiny, is it? That doesn't sound much, but it is a significant number within the context of UK archaeology. I feel
it's significant. It's about as much, if not more, than what the largest profiling profession take as a representative sample. So it's significant, you're saying, in terms of representing.
Somewhere between, it must be at least 5 to 10%.
Yeah, about that much.
That kind of, yeah.
It depends what large infrastructure projects are on the go, I guess. But yes, it's significant. But yeah, no, there's been positive. Again, shout out to Prospect Branch, because they did quite well. UCU have done their own thing, which again has been good. And again, as I said, it got me through the door and it got me in meetings. Unfortunately, early promise didn't necessarily come to fruition, and it's not my place to say what happened in private conversations or who they were with. But effectively, I was talking to a lot of different people who were saying a lot of good stuff behind closed doors, and then Fame haven't released a statement. UA UK haven't released a statement. CIFA's statement only went out to members and by all accounts wasn't particularly toothy. And CBA statement, which is public, was, again, it didn't do any of the things the letter asked to do. And that's really disappointing, because this isn't a moment where, it isn't a moment where you can kind of sit back and do nothing as an influential organization, because doing nothing always takes the side of the oppressor, right? This is a moment you have to decide. You have to decide, are you going to come out swinging for a minority, or are you going to watch from the sidelines as that minority gets bashed? And one of the things that I mentioned in this blog, while the letter was not addressed to the University of York and lots of University of York people signed it,
Yes.
as a University of York person, I'm obviously interested in how my place of work is handling the situation. And unfortunately, the University of York, and this is all in the blog as well, put out a statement commending the ruling, saying it was going to implement the EHRC guidance. And then when they were faced with backlash from this, they hosted a whole bunch of meetings with the trans community and the broader community in York, and gave the scant number of TERFs that turned up equal billing, and effectively said, oh, it's a two-sided, there's nuance to this. We want everyone to be welcome and included. And, well, I'm sorry, but some person saying that they think everyone like me is evil, heinous, and hates women or whatever, and wants us removed from being able to access facilities in the university, they should not. Like, the university would never, ever, and this isn't just York, but any university or any workplace that have done stuff like this, they would never ever hold a public consultation to decide if any other minority should be allowed their rights in work. They wouldn't have had a listening event to decide if students of colour can access services in the university. They wouldn't have had listening events to decide if women can access services in the university. They wouldn't have a statement still on their website that commends a ruling against any other minority if a major organisation like the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention has said the things that they're commending are evidence of genocidal intent. It was just a whole lot of hypocrisy that makes me feel unsafe here. It makes me feel unsafe attending any of the other universities or any of the other places of work that I know are supportive of what's going on. And it's, yeah. And so again, while there was a lot of positivity, and every single person who signed that letter has, you know, they've done a fantastic thing. And I'm telling you, you should feel safe working with anybody on that list,
yes,
regardless of what their place of work is doing.
Of course.
However, because and like I was in the situation where I was about to go on field school, about to run field work, explicitly on trans inclusive practices in the field in a gay village in Manchester with lots of trans volunteers, while having the branding of an organization who said that it supports a ruling against our equality. And like, if this had happened in a year, right, if the EHC guidance was out and the university had policies in place, would my dig even be able to go ahead as I planned by being affiliated? And that's the worry. It's the worry that it's going to affect research, affect students. There's so many layers, and it's like every time I say a sentence, I think of another reason why the ruling and organizations who support it, or the inaction from various bodies within archaeology, how damaging it is. But yeah, when push comes to shove, silence is no longer an option. This isn't a hypothetical. This isn't a both sides situation. You either support a minority or you oppose it. You cannot sit on the fence when it comes to human rights.
Wow, thank you for that very clear explanation. And I feel I have to ask, what can we do now? Where can this go? This lackluster at best, in fact, actively, you know.
Yeah.
You said the word laissez-faire, which is, it's active choice not to make a choice. Is that a fair thing to say?
Oh no, it's absolutely. I think this was brought home with why the article is on your blog. So we'll get to that before we can go next, because I think this demonstrates the exact situation. So immediately after this, I was in a meeting with my research center, and they were like, any updates? And I was like, I feel crap. Here's an open letter, but ultimately I feel really bad. I don't feel good. I don't feel safe. I don't know how I can do this right now. And they were like, okay, well, we'll share the open letter around because that's really good. Take your time. And they were being really supportive. That was really nice. And one of my colleagues, John Schofield, was like, okay, well, I've got contacts with various archaeological magazines. I think you should pitch them an article. They'd be interested. Why don't I put you in contact with them? So I was put in contact with various editors, wrote a pitch. Some of the magazines were like, no, we're not going to touch that immediately. One of the magazines was like, this sounds perfect. We'd really want to go ahead with this. Can you get it into our next edition? And I was like, when's the deadline for that? They were like, a week. And I was like, we'll go the edition afterwards. And they were like, yeah, that's no problem. So I wrote the whole article, sent it over. The editor was like, this is fantastic. Minor changes, no problem. Whatever, whatsoever. We really want to go with this. That person then stopped emailing me. They were clearly taken off this. And I started getting emails from somebody higher up at that organization, basically saying that they had some issues with the argument. And this is all laid out in the foreword to the blog. But in brief, effectively, they had issues with me naming any organizations, which is quite hard when the pitch of the piece was my experience as a professional archaeologist in the UK, if I can't talk about my place of work anyway. And they had issues with me insinuating in any way that there was transphobia in UK archaeology, either through these organizations, either by citing what they're saying and comparing it to what experts define transphobia as, or by simply saying, in my experience as a trans person researching transphobia, I feel this. They very clearly wanted my piece to basically transform into an excuse piece for what's going on, effectively saying it's really sad, everyone's, we're all upset and trans people are being hurt right now, but they're doing what they can in these uncertain times, effectively is how they wanted me to conclude, which again, and I sat through lots of meetings with this person, and every time more and more got knocked off the article, to the point where I felt, actually, no, I can't author, my name cannot be attached to this. So effectively I pulled it, but it was, in reality I pulled it, but it had been killed by the time I pulled it. And then I was like, well, who do I know who, if they tell me that there's any issues with the written stuff, like, because again, I'm not so proud as to say like they didn't publish my work because they don't appreciate my skills as a writer, because it wasn't about that.
No.
And equally, I've worked with organizations who do have to be careful what they say, and I've had to bite my tongue in places that I'm not proud of. And if I could do it again, if I could go back 5 years, I would stand my ground rather than back down. But I understand that that happens. So I was like, but I still felt that they were being far too cowardice. So I was like, well, if I go to somebody I know who has a proven track record of supporting, the work that I've done and the work that other minorities have do, and they tell me things can't be in the article, I'll actually believe it. And so I was like, Howard, you're perfect for this. We've got a working relationship. I know the work that you've done. And again, I won't go into too much detail, but you can read it. The blog is as it was because you were like, yeah, no, this is all fine, because it was always all fine. And you did the classic change a couple of like sentences that need a little bit of rework, which I'm always happy to do. But again, you saw that what I was trying to say was fair, reasonable, and evidence-based. Evidence-based, and that's the thing. And agreed that it was this active choice to not choose a side, which was why that this magazine had decided to kill it, because they feared supporting trans people would effectively upset their base.
There's things I could say about this. It's clearly the tip of an iceberg of how many in the professional and academic world behave. Not only on this issue, but on many other issues. As a professional editor, an experienced academic editor, and a researcher, I have many stories of my own experiences. I've heard stories from others. I'm probably on the wrong end of some of those stories in terms of my editing choices and criticizing things that people feel passionate about that have to be in articles. But at the end of the day, as an editor, my job is not to censor, but is to question, challenge, and ensure that things that go through a peer review process have scrutiny, have integrity, are ethical, and can be supported. Now, you can never, in a peer review process I'm talking about here, you can never, there's been occasions where I've heard rumors and accusations afterwards of deliberate misrepresentation, plagiarism or misrepresentation that as an editor and my peer reviewers could never see. But on this issue, this is not going through a peer review. This is simply me allowing you to have a space, a platform, literally a platform. But still, the same issue. I think it's important to say for those listening that if there was anything in what you'd written that wasn't anything other than you claimed it to be, a personal reflection as an emergent expert, as a researcher who is not only working on that topic but its broader implications, I would say, but I'm not. Seems very clear, very articulate, very evidenced, and of course people will have opinions about that, as we all do. We can't all sing from the same hymn sheet, but this deserves in this time to be out there. I feel really ashamed that this is the best option for you, because my blog is not. I have occasionally aired personal perspectives on UK archaeology, but I self-censor so much on so many issues that I feel really ashamed that my rather anodyne blog is the best option, I think that is. I think anyone watching this and listening to this, we should all be bloody ashamed that this is the best option. But of course, I'm very proud of what you've written. I think it's very important what you've written. But you know what I mean? I'm frustrated that this is where it comes to. But you want something out there quickly that makes a statement, and I think people will reference it and use it if people read it, think about what it says. And I suppose what I want to next ask you, and unless you want to add anything else about that, is what do you hope we do building on this? What should these organizations and individuals be doing that they're not?
Yeah, no, I think that's very important. And but yeah, just to quick, before I answer that,
Yes.
to quickly come back, I think you're hitting the nail on the head there. The editorial process is not about, it shouldn't be about censorship. It should be about making sure that any claims are evidenced. And I think that's why I think it works on your blog, and I appreciate you having read it and talked to me about it as well, because trans people are not saying anything that can't be evidenced. My article is not saying anything that can't be evidenced. And again, I'm not saying it's the be all and end all article. There's so many resources out there that I'll get onto. But yes. I think it says what needs to be said about the state of transphobia in UK archaeology right now with evidence. And it's a real shame that it didn't manage to get out in a major magazine, because I think more people need to hear it. And it's a real shame the reason it didn't get out was not to do with writing quality, which is a whole different kettle of fish, but to do with this not wanting to rock the boat attitude. So that leads on nicely to where I think archaeology needs to go now. It needs to rock the boat. Quite frankly, we are so far past the time where we can have we can have groups, we can have think tanks, we can wait and see what's happening, we can have LGBTQ plus networks. Like, don't get me wrong, these networks are great and I would never advocate for them to be closed down, but having that network and not listening to what they demand does not mean you actually have an LGBTQ plus network. You just have effectively a WhatsApp chat full of your local queers. And hey, everyone likes a good LGBT WhatsApp chat, but it's not the same. So I think what archaeology needs to do is twofold. Organizations need to actually realize that they have authority, they have influence, and that they're squandering it, which is devaluing archaeology as a discipline, devaluing archaeology as a career, but most importantly, allowing minorities to face persecution without allyship and support. If a major archaeological organization in the UK stood firm and said, hang on a second, this ruling is based on a misunderstanding of gender, which we can show through deep time perspectives of gender, or hang on, as an organization that employs thousands of people or represents thousands of different people who are employed in archaeology who do away work, they've never had an issue with trans people sharing these spaces. Why are you making something out of nothing? You know, if these organizations are able to do that, that will have a huge impact, because it's about, I mean, this sounds stupid because human rights should never be up for debate, but we're here now, so we've got to fight the battleground that we're on. It's about hearts and minds. It's about stopping new people falling for the transphobic rhetoric. It's about challenging transphobia at source and basically proving that trans people just live like everybody else. And authoritative organizations can do that, and archaeology, as we've discussed throughout this interview, has a perspective to do it from. But also I think it's about individuals as well. Like, if these organizations are not going to act, individuals do. So in direct response to this guidance, don't police the toilets, please. Just simple things like that.
Yeah.
Or malicious compliance. If your place of work insists, or there is somebody at your place of work who insists on ensuring that only biological or cis women use a woman's space, maliciously comply. Demand that they provide their passport, demand that they provide their birth certificate. But birth certificates and passports could be changed, so you're going to need to have an up-to-date list of everybody with a gender recognition certificate. And so maliciously comply, show that this is impractical, and it slows stuff down.
Utterly impractical as well as immoral.
So,
Yeah.
It's so I would say oppose it however you can. Don't follow the guidance, and if your workplace make you follow the guidance, maliciously comply to the point that they cannot enforce said guidance. And check in on your trans colleagues, check in on your trans friends, and help them. I think that's the thing. There's a lot to be said about what archaeology can do and what archaeologists can do within their discipline, and all of that is important. But also help each other as human beings, regardless of where you are. And so I think, for me, the most important thing, the thing that I want people who watch this to take away, or who read the article to take away, is trans people are just trying to live, and in the case of archaeology, we're just trying to be archaeologists. So let us, don't stand in our way, support us, and do not try to segregate us, because, well, I think it's pretty self-obvious where history comes down on for segregationists. But yeah, it's existential for trans people right now, and we need as many allies as we possibly can.
I can only thank you for your steadfast voice on this topic, and I think we all need to hear this and learn, and to just remind everyone that despite the rhetoric of complaining, fear-mongering, your clarity and your calm it's just phenomenal, given the circumstance of and the hope, despite what we've seen, is comes through very clearly that there's every opportunity for us as individuals and organizations to absolutely shut this down. And I just hope we can force these organizations to not sit on the fence. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me the platform as well of the interview and the blog.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.